Morning and good afternoon to all our guests today. Thank you so much for joining. I'm very pleased to be facilitating today's very interesting webinar, which also marks the kickoff of a series of healthcare webinar taking place on a monthly basis and addressing and shedding the light on different healthcare topics, challenges, and insights. Before we start, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists for today's webinar. We have Mr. Jaif Sani, who's our operations and entrepreneurship expert. We have Dr. Mohammed Khurshid, who is a GID professor and renowned authority in digestive diseases. Mr. Richard Dalala, who is a former McKinsey consultant in the healthcare industry. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Giuseppe, a biologist with insightful healthcare perspective. And myself, I'm Nada Roshid. I'm a principal, a change and transformation at Leverage Experts. So we shall start now with our webinar. And in case if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box and our team will be notifying us so we can then address your questions and concerns. Dr. Mohammed, we will start with you. And from your experience as a medical doctor, what are the main insights and highlights you can share in regard to the current healthcare scene in both the GCC and Egypt?
Thank you, Nada, and thank you for all the guests and colleagues here with us in the webinar. I think it's a great activity, and I think we'll benefit a lot from each other. In the beginning, we can see a big revolution in the area, in the era of healthcare, and we always say is that every 20 years, the healthcare system changes completely, and even the healthcare knowledge changes. And if we can see, for example, what's going on in Egypt right now, it's the development of a new system of united healthcare health insurance, and this, of course, will change the scope of services that we are giving to our patients. In the current time, we can see the new KPIs, a new system for quality accreditation in the Egyptian hospitals, the Gahar accreditation, and now all the hospitals are trying to take this accreditation and pass this accreditation to be enrolled in the United Healthcare Insurance. And we can also see that we started to make a mass procurement authority to buy all the new equipment, and this of course allowed us to obtain the most recent technologies and the most recent investigation machines, and this will open a new era of services, the era of protective medicine, or the era of early diagnosis of cancers and of diseases in general. And we have a policy right now that says that if we can stop the disease from the beginning, it will make a big difference, and we will not find a lot of chronic cases, and will not repeat what we had during the hepatitis C before getting rid of it completely in Egypt here. So if we are talking about the region in general, we can find an increased prevalence of functional disorders. And I think if we are 10 people here now, 9 of us has IBS, for example, and some of us are a little bit irritable, some of us are on anti-anxiety drugs, and this became the normal right now with the rapidly moving world and the rapidly moving situations we are currently living. We also find a lot of immune disorders and the emergence of diseases like ulcerative colitis, like psoriasis, and so. And this is we find this a lot more in the Gulf region, because there is a lot of marriage within the same families. And of course, we know that marrying from the same family increases the risk of immune diseases. And if we also talk about the GCC and the Gulf region, we will find two types of people. Number one are people who are the citizens, and these are not actually the most of the people living in the area. So the citizens suffer mainly from the inherited disease due to the family marriages, and also because of a lot of people coming to work. Like, for example, in the UAE, I think the people working from outside the UAE, inside the UAE, are much more than the citizens themselves. So we find a lot of new diseases that is not always seen in the region, that is endemic to their ethnicities and races. And that's maybe why we find diversity of doctors to help in some disease that we see. So if we can sum up in general, we have a change in the system of healthcare in the region. There is innovation. There is more implementation of quality measures. They give now more care to the quality of service. And of course, we are into the preventive medicine more than the curative medicine. We care about the early diagnosis of cancers and chronic diseases. And getting back to Egypt, we started doing the preventive medicine starting from the first day of birth. We take a sample from the babies to check for inherited disorders, and I think this will, of course, decrease the disabilities that we will find later on. We start to do regular checkups for the school children, for anemia, for malnutrition, for their eyes and their hearing, and so. And we try to fix things early. And even later on, we started a presidential initiative for early detection of cancer colon and for prostate cancer, so cervical cancer, and for lung cancer. And we reached after like 2 months screening more than 1 million cases. So we have a lot of people, and this is also something that opens the way for healthcare investments. We are 105 million citizens. All of us get ill. So if we get back to what President El-Sisi said during the African Healthcare Summit, he said that we already have 700 hospitals and we have 5,400 primary healthcare facilities, and we need them to be doubled. And that's why we find a lot of new healthcare facilities starting, and they are enrolled on the list of the United Healthcare Insurance to fulfill the need for medicine. And that's why we find a lot of new hospitals and healthcare facilities, and they open even the door for the evolution of primary healthcare facilities, private primary healthcare facilities that is paid from the government. So that's an overview of the situation currently.
Thank you, Dr. Khorshid, very much. Now we're moving to another aspect maybe of the healthcare scenery in both GCC and Egypt, and we're moving to to Mr. Sani. How would you see from an investment perspective and the investment trends, how would you see the scenery is moving now, and which sectors do you believe they're receiving the main funds now?
Thank you, Nada, and thanks everyone for joining in. I think, an easier way to answer that question is if we actually divide it into macro as well as regional trends. And an easy way to actually see that is with a growing, and just going back to what Dr. Mohammed had actually hit on, which is, you're looking at a variety of different caregivers with several areas of expertise coming into the region. And that's actually because as the GCC is growing in its expatriate population, so are the complexities of therapy management in this part of the world. And so healthcare infrastructure happens to be a very big part of that investment procurer. There's a capital injection that's been shot in both from a public as well as a private sector point of view, where a lot of investment goes actually into the data analytics side of things to manage patient outcomes, but also from not just from an inpatient point of view, but also outpatient and home care. So those are areas where caregivers tend to focus on to how to manage healthcare outcomes and solution outcomes without overloading the current resources on the operational setup, which is something that one sort of needs to take into consideration, which is a really easy flow into the next topic that we're talking about, which is more in terms of how do we manage that data without really having data breaches. And I think at this point, technology tends to have a spillover effect into healthcare. So talking about interoperability, we're looking at chain management of data. We're looking at cybersecurity to certain angles, but also to a large extent, that entire flow of patient data management from initiation to diagnosis to control or prevention, and obviously ultimately you have your solution outcome, is something that needs to be managed quite well. And bear in mind, at this point in time, we're not just talking about the caregivers, we're also talking about the insurers, because a large proportion of your population, and I'll focus on Egypt in a hot minute, but a large proportion of your population in the GCC is expatriate driven. And so with large incumbent insurers, there is a spillover investment that comes across into insurers, making sure that they collaborate well with caregivers, but also at the same time having their policies per patient or policy per consumer being as comprehensive as possible to take into consideration the ever-changing therapy landscape. And of course, with that taken into consideration, there is only a certain amount of, well, investment into resources that can be taken in. But then the beauty of actually living in a hybrid world is that we can actually connect the world a lot easier than we did 10 years ago. And so telemedicine comes into the picture. And how do you leverage those connections with large bodies like Cleveland Clinic and Mayo Clinic and Johns Hopkins? And what is it that they can bring to the table today without really adding that additional throughput of potentially overburdening the overall infrastructure elements of healthcare in the Middle East. And I think that actually comes across into layers upon layers of project management, layers upon layers of changing the landscape in terms of how do we address the patients? How do we move forward from here? And who are the different stakeholders that we take into consideration with working at this? And obviously, moving this forward, another element that comes in is education, right? Because there is a turnover of healthcare providers in this part of the world, and we need to ensure that at any given point in time, we are training the people who manage patients with direct access, who have the best-in-class training that they can provide. And I think training and education becomes a huge pivotal part of that investment moving forward. Regulatory bodies need to keep up with this, and of course, the norms and the policies around that. So I would say comprehensively, this is pretty much what we're focusing on. Of course,
Okay.
I did talk about the GCC. Let's talk about Egypt. Egypt is a hot pot of potential in terms of what we can do. And I think, Dr. Mohammed, maybe, one of the biggest hospitals that comes into name is Sabah Khamseen or 57357. In terms of all the work that they're doing today to be able to reference themselves as a reference site for the rest of the country, one can really, learn a lot with regards to the changes in evolutionary best practices, the adoption rates that they're taking in, but also how do they leverage international knowledge and bring that and tailor it and design it to the Egyptian landscape. So taking a lot of this into consideration is excellent. It really does pave a wonderful, I would say, greenfield scope of opportunity for this part of the world. But yet at the same time, we also need to be careful so as to not over-engineer this investment landscape. Because at the same time, it's easy to be able to create or open the doors for a lot of players to come in, but it becomes very difficult to create the regulatory aspects if we don't control the policies around it, so as to streamline both investment, infrastructure, and outcomes from the onset and throughout.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you very
think
much.
it's very insightful, the point about the regulatory, which we will discuss more thoroughly in our webinar today, and the challenges also we're facing in that regard. Thank you for the insights, Mr. Sani. Now we move to Mr. Dalala. From your perspective now, after we discussed a bit on the investment side and on the overall healthcare scenery, from the perspective of technology investment now, where would you see a rising trend or a priority, in your opinion, where healthcare practitioners or investors need to pay more attention to?
Well, thanks, Nada, and glad to be here for this webinar. So I actually think that the GCC countries and Egypt will see many of the same trends we see internationally when it comes to technology investment. I think that the area here is obviously growing in terms of the economy, so some of these trends may accelerate. I think the way I like to think about these trends is really technology related and more policy related. So one obviously in the technology related one big one that was accelerated by COVID was telemedicine and remote patient monitoring, something that we've already touched on in this webinar. So telemedicine really helps ensuring access to the underserved areas, which might be very relevant in the area here, and also triaging the healthcare issues and making sure that the right healthcare professional would see the right patient at the right time, and that is something that technology helps. In terms of patient monitoring remotely, it does improve a lot the patient experience to be able to monitor the chronic disease sometimes from home, and then it helps also surface early signs of healthcare issues. To the point for Dr. Khurshid's of preventative medicine and treating early as a goal here. So in North America, which is where I've focused a lot on RPM, there's a lot of activity in RPM that we see due to the rapid rise of reimbursement mechanisms. And so that is what is leading to the adoption of that technology. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that in the region. So if we move on, I think for technology, obviously a big one is data analytics and AI, right? These technologies are very powerful. They can optimize healthcare operations, you can personalize treatments, and even predict disease outcomes. And one particular field I'm very involved in is called measurement-based care. So what this is we're using standardized assessments and data collection to basically track a patient's progress over time in their treatment. And so that improves treatment effectiveness, but also helps demonstrate the value to the payers. What's Jim's point about making sure that you tie into the economic argument of technology. And then finally, one trend that we've been seeing is that wearable tech trend, right? So these are not only cool gadgets, right? It goes into the chronic disease management from the patient side, and also helps with the early detection and prediction of issues. So this is something I think that we're going to continue seeing. If we move away from technology and in terms of policy-related trends, I think two trends that we'll see is interoperability of electronic healthcare records. So this is something that many countries have had challenges with, where several companies will come up with their own system, and then one hospital might not be able to properly communicate information with another healthcare system. And so I think that having an established centrally governed architecture for how you exchange that information, I think is going to be something that comes with that technology of EHRs. And then finally, it often comes to insurance coverage. So, ultimately, if we want to see those digital technologies flourish in the region, they have to be supported by funding and reimbursement. So I think that, if the technology investments really, they need to be attuned to what is reimbursed right now and what will be funded in the near future. Because I think that this will really, essentially, it's a leading indicator of the adoption of any technology in any country.
Thank you very much, very insightful indeed. And again, we will speak again about the regulatory challenges further on during our webinar, because I think it's a very common area of challenge, and lots of people might be needing insights on that as the healthcare industry is really evolving and growing. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Giuseppe, now from your experience, can you share with us some highlights about genomics? And then afterwards, can you maybe share from your experience how come this could be a way and a very, different way and more efficient way in improving our healthcare system in the region?
Thank you, Nada. Let me start saying that it's a really interesting moment for any specialist in advanced therapy. Genomics and regenerative medicine are poised to play a transformational role worldwide, and even more in the GCC. These fields, as Mr. Richard was mentioning, recently powered by artificial intelligence and big data analysis, are holding a very huge promise for diagnosis and treatment. But in my point of view, the very big impact is going to be on the prevention, as Mr. Mohammed was mentioning. Whenever we are speaking of prevention, well, my mind goes to the whole genome sequencing that Saudi Arabia is promoting, and is part of the 2030 vision of Saudi Arabia, where they want to basically carry out the sequencing for all the Saudi citizens to reduce the risk of genetic transmitted disease. So this is something that is going to have a huge impact, not only for the population, but also for the worldwide healthcare system. The correlation and the analysis of such huge amount of data will be basically unique in the world. And of course, there are several technical and medical challenges. As Mr. Richard was mentioning, technically, it's really important to have a very well-established operational flow whenever we are speaking of biological products and analysis. At the same time, we have to consider the ethical point of view. And of course, the investment point of view. At the end, in my opinion, it will be really important, the collaboration between private entities and government to allow such huge results. And also to guarantee that everyone in this region will have the access to this kind of technology that sometimes until now are still quite expensive for the majority of the potential customers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We will then move to Mr. Dalala, and maybe we go back to the importance that has been mentioned over and over again, technology, AI, and the importance of that also in the evolving healthcare industry now, and the need to actually capture on that and leverage on this technology. In your opinion, what are the main challenges you see in technology regarding data privacy and regulatory compliance now?
Yeah, so great question. So with technology comes challenges, right? And there's a few challenges that I think are now quite prevalent with when it comes to technology in healthcare. First of all, is data security, and I think that we need to talk about this first because I like to say the example: if you get your bank account info stolen, you can change your bank account info, but if you get your medical history stolen, you can't change it, right? So this is invaluable information, and healthcare organizations need to invest in robust security protocols. And also, another point about data security is, well, your chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and you have several actors that are touching that data across the across the value chain, if you want, of that data, right? So you can think of healthcare organizations, the provider themselves, even the technology companies that house that data. And so I think each of these players need to have that common set of security protocols for that data. I think another one is the complexity of regulatory compliance. So healthcare is highly regulated, and for very good reasons, right? And I think that companies that venture in healthcare, they really need to have a deep understanding of those regulations to make sure that they meet those compliance requirements. In my previous experience, for example, in telemedicine, I thought of an interesting example where you have a virtual session, right? And the patient might be traveling in one location, the provider might be working from home in a remote location, and there's a virtual session. So where does that virtual session happen, right? Does it happen where the patient is? Does it happen where the provider is? And the answer is actually, it depends on the jurisdiction, right? And so I think companies need to really know those rules, because otherwise they might not be in accordance with those regulations. A third one that I like to talk about is data ownership. So as our digital health data set increases, who owns the data, right? Is it the patient? Is it the healthcare system? Is it the technology company that houses that data? And that's important because the person who owns that data has a right to say about it. But I think, ultimately, there must be a balance between safeguarding that data ownership, but at the same time, making sure that we make access to that data so that it can further its means to essentially advance medicine, right? So there are rules and regulations around that about sharing the identified data, making sure that you have, protect patient confidentiality. And I think that this has always been a challenge. And then if I can finally touch upon a last point is, and I think this has been already mentioned, the ethical use of AI, right? So AI is and will become more integrated into healthcare. I think this is not something we can, avoid, but there are obviously ethical considerations considering the bias of the technology, the transparency, the accountability of AI. And so obviously this is a big topic for regulatory bodies around the world, and it would be no surprise to me that this will be or already is a topic in the region.
Very, I think it's very important. The use of AI now worldwide and in different sectors is becoming a double-sided weapon, as we can say, and as you've correctly mentioned at the beginning of your talk. And I think all institutions need to understand how to leverage on this technology, but at the same time protect the data privacy and protect also the ethical use of it. So I think it's a very hot topic now that's being discussed in all industries, and I think business owners and business decision owners, I think they need to be very careful of that instead of just rushing to use or to overuse technology, but how to also protect potentially the patients and the medical professionals in general in 10 years from now. So thank you for sharing that. It's very insightful. And now back to Mr. Sani. So we've discussed a bit about the healthcare scenery in both the GCC and Egypt, but what would you say briefly are the factors contributing most to making these markets attractive for potential investments?
Okay, good question. We talked about the expatriate, the growth and the exponential growth of the expatriate population. And so one of the things that actually comes to mind is actually medical tourism and the investment into medical tourism and how that can factor in. As the visa norms tend to open up for a lot of nationalities traveling in and out through the GCC in Egypt, medical tourism also tends to pick up. And rightly so, because it is also quite a large area to be able to explore with different doctors from different nationalities with different languages available, several different sort of being a real nexus point of growth and innovation at this part of the world makes it a really good area to be able to focus on and then obviously develop as we tend to mature to becoming a strategic fit or a developed market. But also from a large standpoint, we're looking at a sense of permanence. So with the opening of, say, the Golden Visa in the Emirates, but also similar norms across the GCC, we're seeing a change in population control with respect to people actually looking to live here for long periods of time, which also means you're looking at a gestation of families, which means that certain workforces will tend to grow older, contributing to a larger contribution of the geriatric population, and yet at the same time, a growth of the neonatal population. And so from those areas, a huge investment into, say, home care, specialized neonate centers, and also complexities around that for that data management tend to become very clear areas to invest in. Now, because of that and because of the potential to be able to develop the healthcare infrastructure around it, we're also looking at a huge amount of R&D and innovation. And Richard also talked about this and how we can leverage ethical use of AI, but also at the same time developing small molecules for pharma R&D production. How do we reduce that lead time and cost from, say, a 36 or 48-month period to about 2 to 4 months max? And how do we pump out those molecules on a domestic front to be able to overall lower the cost of production and actually make these, medications a little more easier available? Now, it's a very different discussion when dealing with larger molecules. With small molecules are a lot easier. But also over and above, we talked about this from a large angle. We look at sustainability. Now, that's really the next hot topic, but more importantly so, because hospitals and hospital setups, group purchase organizations are notorious for not having the best sustainable practices, and it's only because they operate at a high level of efficiency at all times. And so in a way to try and standardize sustainability across the sector, public and private, would really be the next best space to be able to focus on. So bringing in a lot of ESG, you're looking at carbon credits. One would consider the leverage of experts such as McKinsey in the MBB world and the Big Five to be able to try and craft the right standard protocols or standardized protocols within these organizations to really leverage that sustainability footprint, or a better one at that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very insightful. And maybe building on that, Dr. Giuseppe, this is for you. After we understand now more from the investment scenery in both those regions, what do you think, in your opinion, the potential of GCC as an appealing healthcare market is for the people?
Yeah, as we're mentioning, there is a huge change in the population here in the UAE. That at the end is nothing else, also the results of the stability that now this region is having after 2 decades of tension in the region. So at the moment we have a market, in my opinion, that is ready to receive new technology, ready to receive new know-how, not just as it was in the past, with the idea to, let's say, buy and don't understand. There is the interest of the authority to prepare, to shape a new, more sustainable healthcare sector that is able to don't just take from outside, but build internally. So this is something that, in my opinion, is absolutely interesting. Also, if we consider a 3.5 trillion governative funds that are available in this market. So that will allow pharma company, but also huge health group to invest here with the support of the local governments to build something that is going to be more stable and for projects that are not more on the 3 years terms, but with a very long view.
Yeah, well, the pharma companies is always a big thing, I believe, when it comes to attraction. That's very correct, and also to encourage even the healthcare, I mean, investors to enter into a market. Which brings me to my next question to Dr. Khurshid. Can you please share with us briefly, from your opinion, the prevalence of specific health conditions and specifically maybe chronic diseases in both the GCC and Egypt? Dr. Khurshid, you are on mute.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
We can't address actually accurate numbers for the prevalence of diseases in the region. Actually, we don't have the demographic data or the demographic studies accurate or exact. But if we can keep in general or speak generally, what we actually see in our practice is now a lot of metabolic syndrome, things related to diabetes, things related to cardiac conditions and to obesity. And that's the main prevalence we can see, or the main data we can take from the patients we see right now. But actually, we can't spot the prevalence of cases. Maybe we have some cancers, but actually we don't have accurate demographic studies for the regions. And from this point, I quote Richard in his words regarding the data regulation and the big data and how we can use this. Maybe after we digitalize our practice in the region, we will have insights and we can see it. And of course, gathering data maybe had some time because of the cost of collecting data and the cost of digitalizing the healthcare practice. This, of course, make it very slow to collect the data, and also regulating the data and how our data is not taken by some people who don't want to give it to. For example, here in Egypt, we started to do the digitalization in certain chronic diseases and certain diseases that it spread, like liver disease, for example, which was a big problem in Egypt, and diabetes and cardiac conditions, and cancers. Of course, we started to collect them, but we had some regulation that says that we can't collect them on cloud databases or cloud servers. We have to own the servers that we keep the data on. Or at least be an Egyptian servers, and of course the service providers for national servers and database. That's something new in dealing with healthcare. So I think until now we can't have exact figures to talk about, but maybe in the coming few years there will be a lot of data. And also getting to Jeev and what he said regarding the telemedicine and how it's very important to cover areas and remote areas. And we started some experience. Even have a published paper on telemedicine during the COVID. And without telemedicine, we wouldn't have been able to deal with our patients. In spite that till now, telemedicine is not approved by law, by Egyptian law. You can check the patient virtually. But we had something, a roundabout, small roundabout, that we put the systems, the telemedicine systems at general practitioners with doctors. So the doctors perform the examination and talk to us, and we tell the doctor what to do until we have an accurate law to regulate the use of telemedicine. And also, Giuseppe, you talked about the genome and how it's important. We started the Egyptian genome program in March 21st, 2021, and maybe also this will give us a lot of insights about the Egyptian gene sequencing and so on. I think it will do a lot of benefit. Until now, what we know is that it's the biggest research project going on now in Egypt, but until now we didn't see how things are going. We didn't hear how where it reached. Maybe in the near future, I don't know, but we start on this. But I think after digitalizing the healthcare and after making the computers and databases available at clinics, I think things will be different, and we will have accurate insights of the disease prevalence in Egypt and the region.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Khurshid. We move then to Mr. Sani, and we would like to take your insights about now the common challenges that you might have seen with when startups rise in the healthcare sector. Obviously, the regulatory hurdles, the market competition. What are the common challenges you have seen from your experience, Mr. Sani?
Great question, Nada. Well, I think we could start with the point that you'd mentioned, which is regulatory. It's definitely a big one out here, and it's because specifically when we talk about startups that deal with medical devices or deal with pharmaceutical products, there is no almost complete product, right? You either have to have a complete product that's gone through clinical trials, that's had the approvals in place, whether it's CE, FDA, or any regional approval. You need to have a working product before it goes to market, which also brings me to a next big challenge out here, which happens to be cash flow. So for startups to operate with that potential, they need a rather large runway to be able to make sure that their lifetime acquisition costs and the customer acquisition, so the lifetime value and customer acquisition costs stay low or continue to lower over a period of time instead of increase. In order for them to do that, having a very agile way of working is not enough. In fact, they would have to leverage partnerships, potentially work with different consortiums to make sure that they try and have the most efficient use of resources. And that also becomes a very big challenge as a startup, because the question is, who's going to take you seriously? You're a newcomer in the market. And so as a startup, they tend to deal with not just competition, but also huge barriers to entry from large incumbent companies that potentially doubt exactly how it is that they'd be able to penetrate the market space and disrupt it. So, one of three things that one can do if you're a startup getting in is you're either the first, or you're the biggest, or you're the best. And the only way that can actually work is if you break it into your own market. So we've seen a lot of disruptors coming in and obviously shaking markets up. There's an incredible company, a young company based out of Abu Dhabi by the name of In Silico Medicine, and they do some revolutionary work with regards to AI-driven therapies and how to track that. But of course, the question also comes up for other companies that tend to question whether the solution is really the right fit for this market, which also brings in, the product market fit questioning. So it may be the right product as a solution for country X, but does it really work at this part of the world? And how quick is the rate of adoption for customers coming through? And that would actually determine the amount of cash flow startups tend to have in terms of cycling this. I can draw from my experience in the past when I worked with 2 startups to acquire VC funding for telemedicine in Africa, but also at the same time dealing with student health records in southern parts and eastern parts of Africa. And the large proportion of that concern that we actually had was not just the rate of adoption, but also talent retention. So yes, you have talent that you can acquire. Yes, you have people that are focused on the same vision. But the question is, will they stay with that vision for a long time, especially when the going gets rough? And so from that standpoint, a question of scaling operations becomes a very big challenge. Startups need to really take into consideration, how do you make it really lean? How do you drive accountability at every level of the organization? And yet at the same time, how do you really deal with the technological challenges that you have Because as we know, skill sets like technology depreciate faster than most other, say, experience-driven organizations on the planet. And so from a large perspective, really driving that adoption rate, the education, and also the ability to pivot when things are not really going the right way, happen to be a very big challenge out there for startups. Last but not the least, and I'd like to conclude with that, is it's also about who you know to be able to open up the right doors for you, having the right stakeholder and KOL endorsement for these startups coming in. Having clinical papers, white paper studies done is definitely one thing. Healthcare economics can definitely help attribute a certain clinical solution selling approach, but it's also who you know who could help shaman your way through a large area of that sector for you to tap into. Because ultimately, that's really who startups need. Someone who's a mentor, but also an advisor to be able to drive that through.
Absolutely, and I think having someone to show the way and pave the way is also applicable for so many types of businesses, because with startups it's always very challenging at the startup phase, obviously, and in order to be able to continue and actually attain the objectives, you need to have someone really showing you the way. So it's a spot on observation. Thank you for sharing that. Now we move to Dr. Giuseppe. So what would be the opportunities for medical professionals to contribute to improving healthcare quality in the region? What is your views on that?
Well, medical professionals play a critical role in improving healthcare quality. This is, let's say, the key point. The expertise, the dedication, the commitment to the patient care are really essential for driving a positive change in this market. That is still a market that relies on the relation between patient and doctors. So, and then, of course, we have to consider again all the educational point of view that we are mentioning.
Yes.
We are facing in the GCC country a real double speed spread of knowledge. We have the younger generation that studied in the US, whenever we have the older generation that actually have a big gap in, let's say, what is going to be what is happening in the world, in their world now. So, and sometime, and I can imagine that Dr. Mohammed have to face a lot this kind of situation. The only person that is able to educate, to explain, to spend time with the patient are the medical professionals. So again, whenever we have big institutions that are in the vehicle, at the end of the everyday, let's say, front line are the medical professionals, and it's important to support them in their working activity.
Thank you for that. I think that the healthcare professionals are an integral part, of course, from the system, and I think even working with them to develop them in light of what's happening in the evolution of technology and systems and practices is also something we need to look after, whether in startups or whether in advanced expanding healthcare centers or hospitals, because I think also their development as well, it will contribute a lot to the quality, as you have correctly shared with us. Thank you for that. Now we move to Mr. Dalala. How do you think the GCC and Egypt both can accelerate digital healthcare adoption by leveraging on recent examples from the rest of the world, and who could be potentially the successful examples around them?
Well, I think overall, it's all about removing barriers, and it's about ensuring that technology is the right solution to the problem. So we talked at the beginning of the webinar, and I think it was Dr. Khorshid, this interesting position about the duality of the healthcare systems in GCC and Egypt, and how these systems do not treat if you want, the same homogeneous population. And so having public-private partnerships, I think is going to be primordial, because then you can foster collaboration between those sectors and share insights. You need to have the right incentives also in the regulatory support that usually comes from the governmental bodies and will favor, if you want, the private sector. I think the second one that I talked about is, we need to think of ways to make technology as a means rather than an angle. And I'll give you a bit of an example where something I've seen in the US is how mental health is being effectively tackled in primary care. And so what's happening is in the US now, there is more and more reimbursement mechanisms to essentially treat mental health in the primary care setting by leveraging technology, which is in this case measurement-based care, as a way to measure the efficacy of the treatment. So when you measure the efficacy of the treatment, you prove the value, which helps payers and their confidence to fund this program. And all of this is nicely encompassed in the best evidence-based care that's been thoroughly proven. And so in that case, you're funding something that works, and it's a bit of that snowball effect. So, what works is when technology is not thought of as an end goal, but rather as a mean towards outcome. I think one obvious one is education and training. So technology is never devoid of people. The way you want to think about it, you will need to train people. So we think of it as current healthcare professionals. Maybe they went to school 30 years ago and they didn't have all the medical tools and the technological tools that are available today. So learning how to use those efficiently, I think, is going to be very important. And obviously, the healthcare technology programs to train the next cohort of experts in the field. So, biomedical engineering, health tech management, all of these fields will need to have funding. And then finally, I think not forgetting the patient is very important. So seldom are technologies that don't require patient engagement. And it's been proven actually that the more patients are engaged in their own care, the better the outcomes, right? So, even at the inception of technology, thinking about technology with patients and users more at large, central to it, I think will be for sure a driver of success and ultimately accelerate that digital healthcare adoption in the region.
Thank you so much. I think it's it's a good wrap for actually what all technology can be used for. We have still so many questions, but we're running out of time. So I would like to remind you all to please write in the chat box if you have any questions. We have one question for you, Mr. Dalala, if you can kindly take it as well. The question from Michaela, and it reads as, how is artificial intelligence currently being used for development of regulatory documents, submissions, approvals, and trends?
Yeah, so I like to think of AI really as two forces, right? The first one is, something that relates to computing power and big data, right? And essentially augmenting that ability. And that other part is where maybe a code is not written. It's about, finding patterns, right? And so I think there's actually a lot of applications to the regulatory landscape when you think about it. So for example, AI can analyze vast amounts of healthcare data, right? And it can actually detect patterns and sometimes abnormalities that you might not be able to find with a human. And obviously this can point to finding areas of non-compliance, right, in regulatory. In terms of predictive analytics, I think that AI can really be useful here to analyze a vast amount of historical data and essentially recognize trends, right? And those trends can be used by healthcare organizations to take essentially proactive measures, right, to address those problems before they escalate. Fraud detection is a big one, right? So this has traditionally been the subject of data analytics, but AI, I think, will be for sure taking over at least a part of that. And then, when you think about regulatory compliance, a lot of it has to do with automated reporting, right? And I think that just the whole process of automation and removing a lot of the work-heavy areas, in that sense, I think AI will really be helpful in pushing those boundaries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dalala, for that. And we have another question from Christian. Is there a need of improvement healthcare insurance? Who pays the treatment costs? Who would like to take that? Maybe yes, Mr. Sani.
So happy to throw some light from a regional context. I think the question isn't really more about who should take the costs, but the question is, what are the costs that these policy providers should really take? So with most regulated markets across Western Europe and the US, or North America specifically, we can see that there is quite a large amount of standardization of cost, unless of course you are a specific therapy provider, and those are few and far between. But of course, for large areas, you can see more or less of a shorter spectrum in terms of the deviation of costs for the same therapy provided or for the same testing group provided. In this part of the world, we're not quite seeing that as yet. So there's no maximum in FMCG, they call that maximum selling retail price, or an MSRP. With regards to healthcare, it certainly is something that is worth looking into, especially when it comes down to how private insurance providers tend to work out here, given the fact that public insurance is not as widespread because of the dichotomy and the change in terms of the difference of the size of populations between the national populace as well as the expatriate populations. So, I think moving forward, an area that is really up and coming, but also quite interesting to focus on, would really be where and how can we reduce the discrepancy of cost for these therapies moving forward and these treatments moving forward? And how do we shorten that spectrum to make that healthcare a little more accessible for the populations that need to benefit from it? So those are really the areas that one needs to focus on. Traditionally, of course, the costs are taken on either by the insurance provider with a co-pay set up to the patient. But of course, you're looking at certain public hospitals that in A&E specifically waiver any cost coming through. So, but at the same time, that operationally may not really make a lot of sense because it adds to the hospital overheads by the end of each financial year of operations. So the question really comes up in terms of how do you really tie that up, and what's the gap analysis here? What is the slippage rate for both the insurance providers in terms of failure to pay of therapy versus that of the hospital, which is the cost reductions? And I think that really is an interesting area to focus on, which could potentially be growing over the next few years.
Thank you very much for that. And we have another question for you. So as mentioned, there is a large proportion of expats in the GCC, and is a common knowledge that they prefer to go back to the responsive home countries for elective procedures and the treatment of more serious conditions. What can the region's healthcare systems do to keep these residents from choosing not to undergo treatment in this region?
That's a great question. I think a large proportion of that has been discussed by my peers here on the panel as well. It is, how do you retain that talent in this part of the world, but also how do you make it more accessible to people? So you could have some of the best, most comprehensive surgeons or doctors available out here, some of the best setups and highly comprehensive, even when compared to some of the most developed countries in the world. But yet at the same time, market access tends to be an issue, or patient access can be a challenge because of barriers of cost, barriers of just genuine physical accessibility, and barriers of language to a certain degree as well. So, there are a lot of areas that one really needs to focus on. And I think a huge area out here would be to leverage telemedicine to quite a degree, because it actually helps reduce the cost of therapy provided. So if I was, for example, going over an ACL surgery, and it's a standard procedure that needs, that can go through. But at the same time, if I happen to go to any clinic out here, I'd potentially get waived a cost bracket of, say, an average of anywhere between $7,000 to about $75,000, depending on who I go to and what's prescribed pre, pro, and post surgery. And so most expatriates tend to find it easier for them to go back home, get the surgery done, irrespective of the quality outcome. Now, that's a question over here to focus on, right? Is the focus really on cost? Is the affordability really the thing to focus on, or is it focus on quality? And from those angles, going back to what we talked about earlier, which is the reduction, or to reduce that spectrum of deviation of cost for these therapies, would really be an area for us to focus on as experts in this part of the world. And how do we make that more standardized for the patients? Yet at the same time, how do we hold the insurance providers accountable to be able to ensure that they're not deviating in terms of those costs and they're cherry picking in terms of what they will reimburse and what they won't.
Very true. And I think we have another webinar scheduled soon talking very specifically about the problems and the challenges of the healthcare insurance and exactly the points you have mentioned, because I think it's a very hot topic now that's being discussed worldwide as well. I'm very mindful of time, and by that we come to the end of our webinar. It passed extremely quickly. I was very honored to be with you all today. Thank you so much for our panelists for the knowledge and for the insightful information you have shared with us. Thank you to our guests. We're very happy to see you again in the coming series of webinars. As I've shared with you at the beginning of the webinar, please follow our page for more information. The webinar will be recorded and shared on our social media platforms. And we look forward to seeing you and hosting you again. Thank you so much again. It was a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.